Okay, the next speaker is Dr. Peter Goldsmith from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. UIUC is one of my alma maters. Peter's a professor of economics at Illinois, and he's also the project director for the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for soybean value chain research, which is funded by my office. So it's a great pleasure to have Peter come here and talk to us about the economics of post-harvest loss, a case study of new large soybean maize producers in tropical Brazil. Peter.
Yeah, I just want to see what the button was rather than advance it. Yeah. Hey, thank you very much, John. Great to be here. I want to thank the ADM crowd for accepting the proposal and the paper and so forth. So it's neat that I'm able to present this. So I'm going to take a little left turn here and talk about large operators and large loss. This is work I've been working in central Brazil probably for the last 13, 14 years in the state of Mato Grosso. And this is some of the work that comes out and helps to inform about, got that, on tropical production. So I think this is really a view to the future as we see the growth in the need for the food supply. My partners in crime, Ana Maria Gaudencio, is a former grad student and working in Chicago, and Altia Moura is a professor at the Federal University of Viçosa in Minas Gerais, and so I want to acknowledge them. I also want to acknowledge funding for the research from the ADM Institute. There are a couple of papers. This is obviously a short presentation. A couple of papers that this work draws on that are recently out, and you can go find those. Obviously, we've got great concerns about food security and where the grain supply is going to come from, moving forward. This work is part of a larger program that I have on the future role of tropical grain systems. That's what I'm kind of fascinated with, especially soybean and maize, so broadland systems. And we see methods for increasing the grain supply, extensification, throwing more land at it. That has significant environmental impacts. Intensification, throwing more inputs at the supply issue. That has implications as well. I'm going to talk about a system here in our case study, throwing more crops, succession cropping. We also have management improvements, total factor productivity. We have a paper coming out on that. And then this, obviously the subject of this is on loss reduction. So the loss reduction is really helps to get at this increase in the food supply. The new production meeting our 2015 goals is going to come from large producers, and it's going to come from tropical producers. That's what's going to, and we need to understand them, and this is one kind of piece of that puzzle. We started this work, if you spend a lot of time in Mato Grosso and driving around, there are a lot of trucks on the road, and your windshield is constantly getting peppered with soybeans from the truck in front of you. There's a lot of loss. This is not normal. It's normal for Mato Grosso, but it's not normal for typical or modern grain systems. So we wondered why a farmer would allow loss, and that's really the subject of this work. So this is a research case study, and we think it helps inform policymakers, and I'll talk about that at the end, and equipment manufacturers in terms of the demand for technologies on equipment. We're really focused here on this economic loss, what's happening at the managerial level. Okay, there's a lot of research out there on post-harvest loss associated with poverty, which is so very important. And also a lot of work in the public policy, kind of the macroeconomic approach. Very little research on the microeconomics of loss. really about the behavioral and managerial issues. And that's our little contribution and niche. The case study site is in Mato Grosso in the center of the continent, on the continental divide. Tropical setting, 12 to 15 degrees south latitude, 6.5 months of rain, 800, 1,200 millimeters of rain, and typical tropical red acidic soils. The components of loss that we think about are harvest loss, that's actual rolling equipment, combine across the field. Short haul loss is taking it from the combine and taken either to private storage or to commercial buyers. And then if you do have storage on farm, that would be part of the PHL question for the way we frame it. PHL in the tropics, it's a lot of soybeans along. That's not the drying slide that Dirk showed. This is the soybeans leaking out the back of trucks along the road. It's very wet, and I'm going to talk about safrinha, this double cropping system to intensify production where you're harvesting when it's very rainy, high moisture environments. And I direct yourselves to this slide right here, which is very characteristic of getting grain moving before a front coming through. You're constantly dodging rain when you're harvesting in the humid tropics. And so this is a big component of farmers' behavior with respect to loss. The PHL situation in Mato Grosso, by the numbers, the world produces about 276 million metric tons of soybean. Brazil produces about 82 million metric tons. Mato Grosso at about 23.5, about 9% of the world's production, about 29% of Brazil's production, and then there's loss, about 2 million metric tons, a little over 2 million metric tons. Most of that is harvest loss at 6%, over 1 million metric tons, and then you have on-farm storage loss and short-haul loss. Okay, so you're looking at about 10%. I mean, this is a big number. African production, about 2.2 million metric tons of soybean, and without South Africa, you're looking at about 1.5. So this is a big number, okay, affecting world market and certainly something of concern and interest. The problem that we looked at, there's a theoretical model which I won't go into, but it's really unique to tropical settings. So this is really a view to the future of intensification of production in tropical areas, which there are lots of research questions beyond post-harvest loss, but we'll stick to that for right now. In this case, the farmers have come up with a way and some technologies to have two crops. It involves short-season soybean. It involves a number of technologies. And safrinha is a Portuguese word for small crop or second crop. So it's a maize crop that follows the soybean crop. But essentially, you get two full crops. You get 3 tons of soybean, and you get about 6 tons of maize. And in terms of yields, for those of you who aren't soybean aficionados, passionate about soybean, the yield is equal in soybean, equal to what would be in Illinois, my home state, and about half the maize yield of what's going on in the U.S. But when you think about the yield of, the yield of nutrients, if you just had a soybean crop and now you add a safrinha maize crop, you're going to increase the amount of energy per hectare. You think about efficiency, about 81% compared to the Midwest U.S., about 27% more protein, and about 25% more oil. So these are highly productive systems. The challenge, of course, is harvesting and planting here in the middle of the rainy season in the summer. Getting soybeans planted is quite tricky. Waiting for the rains, very common problem in the tropics. and that backs up into when you can plant your soybean, which is this, your maize, which is this second row. So it's a managerial intensive process of getting the soybean out and the maize in. The case study, we had 94 farmers. These farmers are not the average farmer in the world and not the average farmer in Mato Grosso. Average farmer in Mato Grosso farms about 1,000 hectares. These are big. These are very well-educated guys. And that's why it's kind of cool to be able to talk to them and understand how they think about PHL, because if they don't think much about PHL or whatever, how they think about it, that affects markets, that affects policy. 49% are engaged in safrinha, the second crop, highly educated. About a third of them have on-farm storage. It's inadequate when you consider two crops, so on-farm storage, it's a whole nother paper, is very scarce in terms of total crop production, but about a third of them measure loss at some stage. Let me just talk a little bit in the final few minutes about some findings. The opportunity cost of loss reduction is high. So meaning, if I want to try and preserve, and I'm really talking about soybean loss, there's this tension between getting the maize crop in and the soybean crop out. And I'm going to sacrifice the soybean crop to get the maize crop in because the dry season is coming on. I've got 75 days from planting of my maize till pollination, and if I don't have rain at pollination, I have serious problems. Serious problems. I've wasted. Maize seed is very expensive, and you don't know when the rainy season is going to end. So the opportunity cost is quite high. So you're going to allow soybean losses to mount to get this maize crop in. So the incentives are weak to reduce PHL. PHL is not on the tip of everyone's tongue. People aren't talking about that. They're talking about getting a crop in, getting a crop out, keeping rolling stock moving. If some grain's on the side of the road, so be it. They've got to move. Okay? For example, common practice is desiccation of soybean. That means you pick up about 3-4 extra days on the harvest, and you're harvesting green beans, which are tougher, and there's loss. The truck fleet, trucks are scarce. You've got to get that grain moving. You don't have the storage, you'll take any truck that there is. Excessive speed at harvest. Rain is coming, you're moving. These are great distances, very poor road infrastructure. And then low investment in on-farm storage. You have limited amount of capital. Farmers are going to put it into rolling stock. They're not going to put it into fixed assets like storage. They need to grow the business, and so so they're underinvested in storage. A lot of agency problems. We talk about owner-operators in the U.S., contractors in Argentina, in Brazil, in Mato Grosso. You have lots of employees. There's an agency problem. They're not as well skilled. They're not managing loss. It's not a top priority. Very hard to control employees operating lots of equipment. Owners do not operate combines. For policymakers. So these farmer commodity group support for PHL is weak, okay, because the private incentives are weak. But there's a lot that the government can do, and there's been a lot of talk about government involvement. And really, this government involvement is very standard stuff. And doing what government should do, can do very well. The boring stuff, building roads, infrastructure really matters if you want to reduce post-harvest loss. A regulatory framework, grain inspection, standards, enforcement, basic stuff. That's really important if you want to reduce post-harvest loss. Commercial vehicle inspection. I mean, there's a lot of fully depreciated trucks on the road that need to be pulled off the road. Okay? Basic enforcement and practice. And then human resource capacity. The private cost to train someone in post-harvest loss is not, the cost is too high relative to the benefit. But technical training in ag schools and technical schools would be essential, would really go a long way, something that governments do quite well. And finally, equipment manufacturers. Really thinking about passive technology. The demand is weak. Lots of sensors, cloud services for managers who are distant, automation, because you've got labor that may not be all trained up, mechanical and human performance monitoring, these kinds of things, so you can compensate based on loss. These kind of passive technologies are really essential here, and very low cost. This is not a high margin environment, especially in these emerging tropical settings, okay? These are late adopters for loss reduction technologies, okay? Depreciation rates on equipment in the tropics is very fast. These machines are being used across 2 crops, used till they absolutely won't run anymore. Capital is scarce, and financing is scarce, so depreciation's is fast. Equipment fleets are large, the workforce is large. So you've got to have technologies across lots of equipment. And then servicing is difficult. Equipment does not come back to the shop every night. It's left out in the field. It'll be out in the field for a while. So how do you maintain, keep things calibrated? So these kinds of things need to be taken into consideration. So that's all I got. Thank you very much, and thanks to the ADM Institute.
We have time for a question or two. Peter was right at 15 minutes.
Hi, my name is Mike Jones. I'm from North Carolina State University. It seemed that in your data set you had about 50% of the farmers who were engaging in that second maize crop and about 50% that weren't. And with the way you've described it, it would seem that the people that are planting that second maize crop would have significantly higher post-harvest losses compared to their counterparts because of these rushing incentives. Do you see that show up in the final post-harvest loss estimates, since that 10% was, I suppose, an average of both groups?
Yeah, in the case study, we actually didn't see it show up. We saw it in the overall understanding. So what's going to confound your answer is whether you're aware of it or you're thinking about it, or whether that's a consideration. So when you're asking them about safrinha and how you manage it and so forth, it's not like those other 50% never heard of the technology or not doing it. So it gets confounded that way. So that bled through in the results, and so they were affected and felt that harvest, there was a tension there between them, whether they were doing it or not. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
One more question?
Yeah.
Peter.
Hey, Cacheta.
Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
You mentioned that a big problem for losses is the deficiency in the infrastructure, basically transportation, because of the roads.
Right.
How do you see the more intensive use of the railway system as a means of diminishing those types of losses?
This is a great question. I think the first time I went to Mato Grosso was in, I think, 2001. And I went to, they had just built a rail line into the state of Mato Grosso. The state of Mato Grosso is a third bigger than Texas. So it's a very large area. And they had built 50 kilometers in the southeast corner. And it was called the Ferro Norte. And this rail line was, all the equipment was wrapped up in plastic and had stopped. And they said, we'll start up in 6 months. Now they've added 100 kilometers in the last 14 years. And so rail is very expensive when you're only moving ag. And I would, a heavy-duty rail line, I think it's hard to find a sustainable heavy duty, not a short short line, just transporting agricultural low-value goods. Usually it's a minor part and it's leverage from mining or some other use. So rail gets into, Mato Grosso doesn't have a second coast, stuff isn't moving from east to west, so it's a dead haul into Mato Grosso, a low population, and there's just not enough value. So they've looked hard at investors, Chinese, everyone's been there to build rail, and it's much faster in, for example, the state of Tocantins, where there's mining, and you can leverage the system that's there. So I would definitely take the under in terms of whether you're going to have rail transportation. It would have to be heavily, heavily subsidized. I think that's kind of the realities of a configuration, logistics configuration like Mato Grosso.
Okay, we'll have to hold the questions there. Thank you very much, Peter.